Welcome and good evening. The Governance and Policy Committee meeting of Wednesday, September the 27th, 2023 will now come to order. The Durham District School Board acknowledges that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships, both historic and modern, with the territories upon which our school board and schools are located. Today, this area is home to many Indigenous peoples from across Turtle Island. We acknowledge that the Durham region forms a part of the traditional and treaty territory of the Mississaugas of the Scugog Islands First Nation, the Mississauga people, and the treaty territory of the Chippewa of Georgina Islands First Nation. It is on these ancestral and treaty lands that we teach, learn, and live. Before we begin the agenda this evening, I would like to note that we have a new code of conduct for public meetings in place that is intended to ensure a safe and respectful environment for everyone in attendance. It encompasses our previous approaches to public attendance at meetings, but puts it in writing to make expectations and consequences clear for all. It is my hope that we have a successful and respectful meeting this evening. The Code of Conduct will be displayed at each public meeting and is available on our website. Are there any declarations of interest? Seeing there are none, there are no declarations of interest at this time. Can I please have a motion to approve the agenda as distributed? Thank you, Trustee Morton. All in favour? The agenda is approved. Can I please have a motion to approve the minutes of the Governance and Policy Committee meeting of May 24th, 2023? Thank you, Trustee Miller. All in favour? The motion has been carried and the minutes are approved. Okay, recommended actions. July 10th resolution, COVID-19 update. And I'll pass it to Trustee Vice Chair Shailene Pinello.
Thank you, Chair. Through you, good evening, everyone. This first item under recommended actions is going back to our July 10th, I believe it was a board meeting, where the COVID-19 reporting process was referred to governance to review. The reasons behind this, as part of the discussion that evening, were instead of removing this tool, as it has been in use since COVID-19 began for reporting illnesses and cases within classrooms and schools, was to instead send it to governance and policy so that we can discuss creating, perhaps creating a tool that can be used on an ongoing basis for families, staff, and communities to report illnesses as a whole and not just necessarily specifically pigeonholed for COVID-19. This seemed like the best place to have that further discussion, and so it was referred to this committee meeting this evening to discuss. The reports, and I believe the recommended actions from the July 10th meeting are on in your packages from page 13 to 17. But I believe at this point we're looking to maybe open it up for discussion for what trustees think, first and foremost, and two, if interest in replacing this tool in another capacity is something that we feel would be beneficial, to then have some back and forth and conversation about what that could look like. Thank you.
Are there any questions from trustees? Student Trustee Cameron.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering a little bit about why. I know that staff had talked about the the work hours that it required to maintain this system. I'm just wondering if it would be able to elaborate a little bit on that.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, and thank you for the question, student trustee. So it's not really an issue of work hours. Much of the work that we've been doing through our entire time in the pandemic is engaging in consultation with DRHD to better understand how it is that as a school board we can respond to what was an evolving situation. At this time, DRHD has shared that the Ministry of Health, there is no plans to provide specific guidance for COVID on health and safety measures in schools. Everything has really been generalized in relation to respiratory illnesses. We have measures in place that if absences exceed 30% of any school population, we would inform the public health unit. So there are already structures in place that even prior to the pandemic that we follow in situations where we feel that there may be an outbreak of some sort in relation to a respiratory illness. At this point, when you look at practices across the province, I can't really name any other school board that is collecting COVID data. So based on our analysis and consultation with DRHD, we strongly still feel that there is no need to continue with the recommendations that were made on the resolution on January of 2022. And we were recommending and still continue to recommend that they be rescinded.
Thank you, Associate Director Markowski. Did you have Student Trustee Cameron?
Thank you, Chair. And I do believe that we are actually the only board doing this still, which I don't think means it's a bad thing, and I think that there can still be value in what we're doing. I'm wondering if we had any system like this before COVID, board tracking general illness inside of schools.
Associate Director Markowski.
Thank you, and through you and Student Trustee, I'm just trying to better understand your question. Can you elaborate?
Yeah. So I'm on the webpage right now with our tracker, and it says total absence due to illness, and it lists all the schools, and then absence positive COVID tests, and then whatever, and then rate of illness. Did we do anything like this publicly before COVID, tracking? Did we, I guess then, did we track those numbers internally as well, through a system or something like that?
Thank you, through you, Chair. So, sorry about that. Our public health unit has a data system tool that we use that we would have been utilizing prior to the pandemic in relation to gathering data on illnesses. That's not something that we in-house was collecting.
Sorry, Trustee Morton.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I'm looking at the recommendation on page 14, and I would put forward the motion that the Governance and Policy Committee recommend to the Board of Trustees that it rescind the January 5th, 2022 resolution of the board. And I don't think I need to read A through D. The details are there.
Are there any additional questions? Student Trustee Cameron.
Thank you, Chair. If we pass this motion that's on the floor right now, I'm wondering if we essentially stop tracking COVID in our schools entirely? Is that?
Thank you, and Through you, Chair. So Student Trustee Cameron, one would argue how accurate any of this data currently is, knowing that some of the tools that we were utilizing to actually track COVID even 2 years ago are not being utilized. So the Public Health Unit, DRHD, does have tools. They have a tool system that if we needed to consult or gather data, we can gather and access that data accordingly. But we wouldn't have any specific tools if this was rescinded to track illnesses outside of general illnesses. There's no expectation on families or students, for that matter, to be disclosing what specific illnesses they have.
Thank you. Vice Chair Pinello.
Thank you very much. I am not necessarily opposed to the motion in rescinding this tool. What I do want to, I guess, clarify is if, I guess it's two parts. So one, if we rescind this and I am a parent and I'm calling in an absence, I know that there's different codes that I can hit on the phone. I can still report illness, but are we keeping track of that information already per school in a way that if, let's say, there was a class who 10 students were missing all for some illness, not necessarily COVID, but that we would be able to look at this and say, is this something going around in this classroom? Did they have a pizza party and maybe it's food poisoning? Like those sort of things. It doesn't have to be COVID-19 specific, but do we have a way where we report that already that we could build on and communicate to community so that they know, you know, right now there's a lot of people sick with we don't know what. But if I'm a parent of a junior kindergartner who I can't necessarily swab for COVID, but I know 4 other kids in their class are ill, I can probably extrapolate that's where it came from, and use that information to inform my decisions. That's more so what I'm interested in, because if that's something we can build on, that I think is where the referral of this came from anyway. That's the first part of my question.
Thank you, and through you, Chair, and thank you for the question, Trustee Pinello. So it's a great point that you're raising. So what we normally do through our Health and Safety Department is that if we're observing what I would say a very inordinate level of absenteeism in a specific classroom or a specific school that would meet a threshold that we would need to consult with DRHD, we have actually levels like the 15% and 30% that I was referring to earlier, where we would automatically, we have contacts within DRHD, where we would start that conversation. Based on the recommendations of DRHD, we may move to providing communication out to specific classrooms or to the school community. I think what I'm trying to get to is a lot of those structures are in place and were in place prior, and we would be utilizing those structures if we're seeing what I would describe as an excessive level of absenteeism in any given school community.
Thank you, Associate Director Markowski. Trustee Thatcher.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. I would like to say that I'm in favor of this motion for the reasons that have been provided by Associate Director Markowski, and also due to the fact that should the government alter its direction on the collection of this data, that the board is prepared to revisit its position. So we have that safeguard. I am in favor of this motion. Thank you.
Do we have any more questions from trustees? Okay. Well, this motion is carried. After we vote. So, all in favor? Thank you. This motion is carried. Okay, so we'll move on to the rescission of use of service animals in schools policy. And I'd like to call on Superintendent Andrea Macaulay.
Good evening, and through you, Chair. The report begins on page 18 of your agenda package this evening. The Durham Board has a long history of supporting the use of service animals in the accommodation of students, with the first service animal going into practice in our schools in 2010. We currently have 5 active service animals active in our schools, supporting their individual student handlers, 3 at secondary and 2 within our elementary schools. In 2019, the ministry announced PPM 163, and at that point, that was the most recent revision of the policy, as well as the addition, the most recent revision to the procedure, as well as the addition to policy. We know since then, with thanks to the Board of Trustees, the board has a strong human rights, anti-discrimination, and anti-racism policy that guides all of our practices, as well as an accompanying procedure for inclusive design and accommodations process. It is based on the strength of both that policy and the umbrella of the accompanying procedure that staff are bringing the recommendation to rescind the policy. To support that as well, our administrative council has recently engaged in an update of the procedure, and that is attached in your package for transparency on that process as well. Happy to take any questions.
Are there any questions from trustees? Trustee Edwards.
Yes, thank you. Through you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to know has this decision to rescind, has this been discussed at the Special Education Advisory Committee as the active group around special education?
Thank you, through you, Chair. No, it has not, because it is not a change in practice or access for students. Most of the students who do access service animals do also receive accommodation services through the district. However, some, such as those serviced by epilepsy dogs, do not.
Thank you. I have some concerns about this because right in PPM 163, the purpose says all school boards in Ontario are required to develop and implement and maintain a policy on student use of service animals in schools. So that means it is there, as well as my background and sitting around the K-12 SDC, Standards Development Committee, around accessibility and education. We were in that committee, and the discussion around services animals came up, and there was an inconsistent process across the board, as well as parents really didn't know how to find it. Looking at PP 163, I understand there's a lot of requirements under there. However, asking a parent to go look for a PPM is to me is not reasonable. This PPM does say that boards must have a policy. I am not in favor of rescinding this because of open and transparency and being able to, the fact that our SEAC hasn't even been discussed about this. I recognize it's not a change, but they should have been consulted.
If I may, Chair Brown, just to pick up on the point that Trustee Edwards was making around the policy point, and obviously that is a decision for this committee and for this board, but just by way of context, I don't, as I say, I think matters of policy are decisions that this committee will have to make and the board will have to make, but I don't think we can put too much reliance on the ministry's use of the word policy. The ministry uses the word policy in sort of a generic sense without saying it's a policy that must be adopted by the Board of Trustees versus a procedure that is to be, adopted by the Director of Education. They often refer to the term policy when they just mean some sort of corporate direction to implement the requirements. And I think that became clear when we were dealing with some of the requirements around COVID, and the ministry published, as they usually do, requirements that boards adopt a policy. And many of the boards wrote to the ministry and said, you know, we don't have a board meeting in August. How are we supposed to adopt a policy? And the ministry's response was that, you know, for the purpose of the ministry document, the term policy should be interpreted as including a process, protocol, procedure, or any other term commonly used by school boards that have a similar meaning. The Ministry of Education is not requiring that a school board's disclosure policy receives approval from a board of trustees. So that statement was not made in respect of the PPM that Trustee Edwards is referring to, but I think it provides some guidance that the ministry's use of the word policy, I don't think we can say they're directing that it be a policy that's approved by the Board of Trustees. They are directing that the school board have these directives implemented in some fashion.
Thank you. Student Trustee Cameron.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for that clarification. And I'm just wondering, I think I heard this, but I wasn't sure, just for clarification. Is this update more of an update to reflect in our policies what our current practice is?
Thank you. The update was made to the procedure, so some housekeeping items such as the reference to an individual versus a student, and just a couple smaller items that just made for clarity for families. If I may as well, usually when students begin the process of obtaining a service animal, schools quite often support that request and or are brought in very early in the sequence with families and the Training Institute, at which time the full package of the procedure is provided to them. So appreciating the access to where the guidance and expectation comes through, perhaps a proposal is that we add the PPM as an addendum to the procedure. One aspect is that it is a fairly thick procedure in terms of the documentation required, but also appreciate the transparency and easy access for families. And it is a package that our school teams work through very collaboratively with families.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from trustees? Okay, with that, it is recommended that the Governance and Policy Committee recommend to the Board of Trustees that the use of service animals in schools policy be rescinded. Can I have a mover for this motion?
I think, sorry, Chair. I believe in our motions we are also supposed to include whether or not the suggestion is to the next board meeting or the board meeting after that.
I will read it again. It is the recommendation that the Governance and Policy Committee recommend to the Board of Trustees that the use of a service animal in the school policy be rescinded. And it should take place at the October 16th board meeting. May I have a mover for this motion? Am I saying that? Oops. This motion is defeated. Vice Chair Pinello.
It's quite something to have to turn my own microphone on this screen. Thank you, Chair. I wanted to go back really briefly to the point before. I know we passed the motion to rescind, but I had actually wanted to move an additional motion that I think might help bridge the two and just clarify. So if I can, I'd like to move the following motion for consideration, that we work with staff to widely communicate and remind community about the automated self-reporting tools that allows students, families, and staff to self-report illnesses, and that we collect this data, publicize, and regularly monitor for future outbreaks or large absence trends. And this should be used in collaboration with school-specific ventilation and air quality data to measure the effectiveness of our prevention measures. It's a very long motion, Jillian. I'm happy to send it to you. The reason behind this just being, I think it's always a good opportunity, especially in cold and flu season, for us to remind folks and also to ensure and assure them that we will be keeping eyes on it and making sure that the ventilation and the filters and the things that we have will be looked at and made sure that they actually are doing what we want them to do, and that in the event that an outbreak occurs, maybe we can get a little bit ahead of the curve and show some leadership in the province on this. Thank you.
Thank you. Director of Education, Camille Williams-Taylor.
Thank you, through you, Chair. There are just a couple of cautions that I would want to place on the table in consideration of that motion. First is the notion of asking people to report illness, that we actually don't ask people to report illness. The exception was made by the Ministry of Education during a time of crisis when the ministry took the purview to have schools collect illness information. So when we do have people calling in to report absence, they may choose to press the button that says illness, but they are not obligated to report what kind of illness or nature of illness. And so it's certainly not within our purview to do that. Secondly, I would caution around moving into the area that is the purview of the health department. We do have a relationship with the health department as well as requirements to report certain patterns to health departments because they are the ones who would identify outbreak. So I would caution about maintaining our scope in education because once we start to undertake well outside of our scope of responsibility, we run into questions of liability and in fact infraction of the law.
Vice Chair Panello.
Thank you, Chair, through you. I just had a question then for clarification. So my language in this is for self-reporting of illnesses, so not specification. And I'm using the example of when you call in and you get the options on your phone, like when someone hits 1 for illness, for their reason for absence, that is what we're tracking, because we're already taking that information, is what I understood from my previous question. So I think the purpose of my motion, and maybe it wasn't worded correctly, is that when we're looking at, Pierre Elliott Trudeau was my elementary school, so I'll use that as an example. If I've reported illness along with 3 of my friends in our class, and they may or may not be tied together, but we also know that, let's just say our classroom doesn't have a filter, or a HEPA filter system. For example, as trustees, when we get those ventilation reports or we ask for absence reports, we can actually look at them together and say, okay, some of our schools that have, really good ventilation or mechanical air filtration, whatever that might look like, also have like lower illness rates than a school just down the road type of thing. And while I realize that there's lots of other factors, I think for us at this table, when we are looking at data that typically isn't necessarily always connected, we're also missing information. And so it is very hard to sometimes consider measures and safety measures, and coming out of COVID when things were much stricter and we had more provincial and local direction. I'm just wondering how we can make sure that we're keeping the data that people are already providing through that phone button press, and looking at it as trustees in our capacity from a governance perspective of, do we need more HEPA filters for this school, or do we need to consider asking the government for increased funding for that in another school where we're seeing patterns? Like, that's where this motion is based in. And so I certainly don't want to step on the health department's toes. That's not my intention. And I realize that we're limited in what we can ask and do and all of those things. But I also think it makes a difference when we're seeing absences or patterns, and we can start to look at what are things that we at this table can do to make an impact potentially at those schools. So I hope that helps reframe. And so with that, I'm open to, I guess, additional wisdom, but I'd be happy to amend the motion if there's words or phrases in there that maybe need to change to reflect that purpose. Otherwise, that's the intention behind it.
Executive Director Jim Markowski.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. And Trustee Pinello, I think what you're outlining, there is currently practices already in place. So we, through our health and safety department, if we are seeing, like I said, trends in absenteeism, in particular related to illness, that would initially trigger a connection in terms of consultation with DRHD, where we would take guidance. I do want to stress and echo something that Director Williams-Taylor said, is that much of this falls within the realm of health. We take lead, we take guidance from DRHD. We work very closely in partnership. Similar to what a previous trustee mentioned earlier this evening, that if there is guidance that we're receiving from the ministry or from our public health unit, we would obviously bring those considerations back to update you accordingly. And if there was a need for us to reconsider our practices, I think there would be an opportunity to do so. I guess my question becomes to the trustees is that in the absence of, when I look at some of the guidance that we've currently received, that they've even gone as far as removing the screening tool that was specific to schools. Now they have a general screening tool for the public. No longer is the focus on COVID or any specific illness. We just talk about respiratory illnesses. We do have measures in place that if we hit certain percentages of absenteeism, as I mentioned, we will consult with DRHD. I just feel that there's already a lot of checks in place with our current practices that is addressing that. Completely understand that if the landscape were to shift and we need to revisit, I think that becomes a larger conversation, whatever that looks like. But I feel pretty confident, and I share that with you just when you're making informed decisions, that our partnership with DRHD really addresses much of that.
Student Trustee Cameron.
Thank you, Chair. Could we see the motion or have it read back to us, please?
Thank you, Trustee Vice Chair Pinello.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you, Associate Director Markowski. I don't want to move motions for the sake of moving motions. I guess my one last clarifying question is if when, let's say, something happens and we consult the health department and they come back and they say, yeah, like 15 kids being absent for illness all at the same time is a little weird, let's do something about it. do we also have the ability to specifically request and have the information about ventilation and air quality measures within that school so that we can consider both at the same time? If and when we do have to, as long as we have access to that information and we can get it in the event that we need to make decisions, I think that's ultimately what I'm looking for. And so I'm happy to rescind the motion. I just want to be sure that we can get that.
Associate Director Jimmy Markowski.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. So we do publicly report on our current ventilation structures. Trustee Pinello, if that's what you're questioning, there are reporting mechanisms in place for that. What I would argue, and I guess maybe it's something that I could do, and I'm just doing this from a position of understanding, what I could bring back to you are what our current practices are within health and safety, that when certain absenteeism rates are reached, what does that look like in terms of practice and consultation between health and safety and DRHD? What are those outbreak practices? It might help kind of alleviate perhaps some of the concerns that you're raising, Trustee Pinello, and just build some understanding, and I'm happy to take that away and bring it back.
Just further to Associate Director Markowski, the DDSB for the last couple of years now, through the ministry, we're required to publicly report on ventilation. So what's the overall ventilation strategy and measures that the DDSB is taking, but also individually in schools. The different type, whether a school is mechanically ventilated, for example, the number of HEPA air filter units in that. Coming up soon, but not yet, is a new deadline to share this information with the ministry, and then after that, post that again on the board's website. On the front page of the DDSB website is one of the 9 buttons on there that does talk about ventilation. So that page is now in the process of being updated with the most up-to-date information. And once that takes place, including the spreadsheet where you can actually look at individually by each school, we'll be able to share that information with trustees once there's an update to it. The existing information is relevant as to, I believe, July 20th of this year. And then after that as well, it's shared on social media and then through different ways through schools. And then just further to that in terms of what we are sharing with families around self-reporting absences. Folks may have, there was a recent change where the absence code was just slightly modified where is it? That it still says absent illness, health, and well-being. So that information shared at the start of the year with families, and then at different points throughout the year is also shared with families.
Chair, if I may, just one quick additional thought, if I may, and thank you, and through you, just to address Trustee Pinello's points, Chair, what I was going to recommend, I can capture a lot of this information perhaps in a memo that I could share with the trustees, and if there was any additional questions that came out of that, I just felt that maybe unpacking some of this so that there's an understanding of how it is that we respond with absenteeism and outbreaks might help shed some light understanding amongst trustees, and then if there's anything further that needs attention, happy to answer any questions at that point, but I could capture all that in a memo and send it off.
Thank you. Vice Chair Pinello, would you still like to rescind this motion, or? Okay, thank you. So that motion is rescinded. We'll move on to the revised privacy policy and rescission of regulation, and I'll call on General Counsel Carter.
Thank you, and through you, Chair. The report starts at page 36 of your package. This matter that's before you is sort of one of those standard policy/regulation pieces that the committee and the board needs to deal with. We had a very short policy that really didn't cover the topic, and we had kind of a longer regulation that much of which belongs in the policy, some in the procedure. So we're proposing to rescind the regulation, and that it's a two or three-page document that starts on page 87 of the package. So we rescind that regulation and beef up the policy with some of the contents of the regulation. And then we've also cleaned up our procedure as well, but that's not contingent on the how the board deals with the policy. So that procedure's already been updated. But the revised policy then, the clean copy of the policy, the clean copy of the old policy is at page 40, but the markup version of the new policy, that's before you, starts at page 41 of the package. And primarily, as I say, it's really to deal with this issue of the regulation, to merge that into the policy, and also it's been cleaned up to reflect any changes in the applicable legislation as well as best practices. So subject to any questions or comments you may have, that's the document before you, and we're recommending that the regulation be rescinded and that the policy be amended as noted.
Thank you. Are there any questions from trustees? Trustee Edwards.
Very rarely I see a policy extended instead of shortened, so this is kind of a new thing, I think, in my comments. But just wondering, because it's such a huge thing, I'm wondering if we're saying replace instead of, because otherwise we're looking at going through all these comments, and I'm wondering if we say to replace the existing policy in its entirety, because it really is a substantial change.
That's a fair comment, Trustee Edwards. So we would alter our recommendation to reflect that. Let's see what words we used in the report.
Revised.
And the policy. And that the, just let me see how we can word that. And the policy be replaced, the existing policy be replaced with the draft policy at page 41. So it'd be there, instead of the policy be revised, we'd say, and that the policy be replaced with the policy that starts at page 41 of the agenda package. And I should also, before, I don't know if there's going to be any more questions, but Fanny Im from my office has come to answer any questions because she did the lion's share of the work on this, which was quite a significant undertaking. So I want to also acknowledge her work on this and thank her for her work and for coming tonight.
Thank you. Do I have any more questions from trustees? Okay, well then it's recommended that the Governance and Policy Committee recommend to the Board of Trustees that the privacy policy be replaced and the regulation rescinded. Councillor Cossa, would that suffice?
If I may, Chair Brown, I would say that the policy regulation be rescinded and that the policy be replaced with the draft policy that's found at page 41 of the agenda package. Just for clarity, I think we specify it in those terms. Yeah.
Do we recommend, may I ask Gillian to bring that up on the screen?
Sure, and then while you're doing that, Gillian, we might also include and that it go before the board for consideration at the next meeting, assuming that's the will of the committee.
Thank you, Councillor Cossa.
So would you, yeah, there you go. And that, I think you need another that, and that the policy. I would say the privacy policy, just to be extra clear. I would say, and that the matter, after the word package, and that the matter be considered.
Thank you, Councillor Cotter. So I'll bring this forward, that the Governance and Policy Committee recommend to the Board of Trustees that the privacy regulation be rescinded and that the privacy policy be replaced with the draft policy that starts on page 41 of the agenda package, and that the matters be considered at the October 16th, 2023 regular board meeting. Trustee Thatcher.
Are you looking for a mover for the motion?
Oh, yes, please. Thank you. All in favour? Thank you. The motion is carried. We'll move on to the revised trustee criminal reference checks policy and rescission of regulation. And I'll call on Superintendent Heather Mundy.
If I may, Chair Brown, Trustee Mundy, I think, is available for questions, but she's remote, so I've offered to take the lead on this.
Thank you, Councillor Cotter.
Just to avoid any issues over the internet. So the report can be found at page 89 of the agenda package. Really, it was a matter of again, getting rid of that regulation and making sure we had a proper policy. The policy is found at page 95 of the package and merely confirms that there is going to be the criminal reference check, obviously, and then we do have incorporated into that a little bit of a mechanism if there's a flag on a check, and that sort of starts at page section 6.4. So we have built in a little bit of a process in case there's a flag and how that would come back before the board. Other than that, it's pretty straight up application of the criminal reference check, and it incorporates the process that staff follow as well for that. So subject to any questions you may have, that is the report and the recommendation that we rescind that regulation and amend the policy. And we may, picking up on Trustee Edwards' point, we may adopt the same language again in our recommendation, which is, and maybe Jillian, if you can pull it up, I can just revise the recommendation to be consistent with what we've just done. You can probably use that one. So, yeah, the government recommend to the Board of Trustees that the trustee criminal reference checks policy, the regulation be rescinded. Put that first. And that the policy be replaced in accordance with the draft policy found at page 95 of the agenda package. So I'll restate that. Subject to any questions you may have, our recommendation is as displayed on the screen. Chair Edwards, Chair Brown, thank you.
Thank you. Do we have any more questions from trustees? Student Trustee Cameron.
Thank you, Chair. Kind of going off of what Councillor Cotter was saying, I'm wondering, it says in the policy, the chair shall consider the concern and take any action deemed warranted under the DSB bylaws if a trustee is found to have, failed the criminal background check. I don't know how to say that in a better way. I'm wondering what an appropriate action would look like under the bylaws. Any options of what the board could do to address that?
I think it would depend based on the nature, the nature of the offense. And through you, Chair Brown, I think it would depend on the circumstances. So it could be that it could be a code of conduct issue. The board may undertake its own investigation of the facts and circumstance. It may rely on public information. So there could be a code of conduct, could be sanctions. So I think it would have to be case by case, but there would be options that the board would have to address any concerns.
Thank you. So then I'll bring forward the recommendation that the Governance and Policy Committee recommend to the Board of Trustees that the trustee criminal reference checks regulation be rescinded and that the policy be replaced in accordance with the draft policy found on page 95 of the agenda package, and that the matter be considered at the October 16th, 2023 regular board meeting. Thank you, Trustee Morton. So, sorry, I should have asked for a mover. So thank you, Trustee Morton, she's moved. All in favour? Thank you. That motion is carried. So now we'll bring forward the timing of the organisational meeting and clarification of other meeting dates. And I'll call on General Counsel Cotter.
Thank you, and through you, Chair Brown. So the report can be found at page 98 of the package. Essentially, there was a legislative change that backed up the start of the term for trustees, and as a result of which, it's backed up the date we need to have our organizational meeting each year. The way the bylaws were worded, it was to occur in the first week of December, which mirrored the requirements under the old legislation. Now we have to do it at the first meeting on the annual anniversary of the start of the term. So in this case, that would be, sometime before November 22nd. We have a meeting scheduled already on November the 20th, but that was a regular board meeting. So what we're proposing is to make the November 20th the organizational meeting, and then make what we had scheduled as the organizational meeting on December the 5th, make that the regular board meeting. So just switching those. So there's a change in the schedule, but there's also a change to clean up the bylaw so that the bylaws going forward now will make clear that the timing of the organizational meeting. So if you look at page 99 of the package, you'll see the amendment there in blue. Now says we've removed that second clause there that said it had to be within 7 days. We've merged it all into one clause, and it just says within 7 days after the term on which the office commences, and then on the anniversary thereafter. And then also we're recommending the revision to the schedule. So those are sort of the two main meetings. Executive Lead Sir Janik also has included in this some changes regarding the summer and December meetings, so he may want to comment on that.
Sure, thanks, Councillor Cotter, and through you, Chair. Just in the recommendations here, given that we were touching this portions of the bylaws, we thought it would be prudent to just clean up additional sections in the bylaws to better align with what our practice as a board has been for quite some time, which is that we don't schedule meetings for standing and board in the summer months of July and August, with the exception, of course, of special meetings that are called. And folks may recall that every year that there is usually a meeting scheduled for the third Monday of December. However, it usually does not take place, and from an agenda planning standpoint, staff aren't planning for reports to go towards at that meeting. So the recommendation there is just to clarify the bylaws to say that both standing committee and the board, are not required to meet in the summer months of July and August, and then specifically for the board, and in December as well, and then specifically for the board, and instead of that meeting taking place in December, it really is that then the first Monday of December. So essentially doing exactly what we need to do for this year meeting cycle, but just enshrining that in the bylaws, just so that consistency is clear moving forward. It doesn't preclude the board from holding a special meeting. And folks have noted usually the timing of that December proposed meeting tends to be quite close to the holiday months, which tends to be another reason why. And it ensures that from a scheduling perspective, when the board has a standing committee meeting that takes place at the beginning of November, then that committee is reporting into what that next board meeting would be, which would be at the beginning of December. And then once you reach January, you end up on a normal cycle again, at the first Monday of the month being standing and the third Monday of the month being the board meeting.
Thank you. Do I have any questions from trustees? Okay, seeing none, I'm going to ask Gillian again. This is a very long motion. I wasn't going to read all of it. It's a couple of pages. So, Gillian, if you don't mind, could you please bring it up on screen?
The section's quite long, so what we'll do is we'll just share the recommendation as it's in the report itself, and obviously for the minutes we'll be recording whoever moves the motion, if there's any amendments and so on. Because the track change recommendation is exactly as written in the recommendations of the report.
Thank you. It is recommended that the Governance and Policy Committee adopt 2 separate resolutions that would come to the board as recommendations. Councillor Carter?
Yeah, so thank you, Chair Brown, through you. So the recommended motions are there now on the screen. You can see there that's, 2 separate resolutions. The first one is amendments to the consolidated bylaws. And we see the amendment to 3.1.1, moving December and inserting November, changes to 3.2.1, changes to the deletion of 3.2.2, changes to 4.2.4, changes to 5.5.1. And then we finish the resolution for this one resolution that the Board of Trustees consider and adopt these changes at the board meeting to be held on October 16th. So that would be the recommended first resolution.
Thank you. Just for clarification, Councillor Carter, are we moving these 2 as 2 separate or combined?
I think my recommendation is you move that as a motion, as one combined motion. If somebody wants to split out the various clauses, we could deal with that separately, but I think I would deal with that as a motion, and then we'll deal with the adjustment to the schedule as a separate motion.
Thank you, Councillor Carter. So can I get a mover for this motion? Thank you, Trustee Edwards. All in favour? This motion is carried. So we'll move now to the second recommendation.
Yeah, and the second recommendation just deals with the scheduled meetings. The board, the reason why we have to do this is because the Board of Trustees, you may recall, you may not, but you approved the schedule of all the meetings. And it's, you know, so, and that's already approved, and the regular board meeting is also part of our bylaws, so we need a motion to revise the schedule. So this is just, as I say, flip the November 20th meeting and the December, oh, I said the 5th, sorry, I apologize, it's the 4th. So switch the November 20th and December 4th meetings.
Thank you, Councillor Costa. Can I have a mover for this motion? Thank you, Trustee Arsenal. Okay, so all in favour? This motion is carried. Right, we'll move on to information items. There are no information items on the agenda this evening. So can I have a mover to adjourn this meeting? Thank you, Vice Chair Pinello. All in favour? This meeting is now adjourned.